Hello, you're watching BBC News with me, Shaun Ley. We're going to be taking a look at tomorrow's morning's papers in a moment with Ros Altman and Mihir Bose. First, though, the headlines this hour. And a meeting of G7 leaders will be held Tuesday to discuss the situation in Afghanistan as thousands of people continue trying to flee the Taliban. Thousands of Afghans have continued their days-long vigil at Kabul airport. Those who've left the country are surprised at how quickly the regime collapsed.
No one expected it would be this quick. No one expected it would be so sudden. And for these Afghans, the crisis is just starting.
In the US state of Tennessee, rescue workers are continuing to look for dozens of people missing after severe flooding. At least 10 people have died. More than 120,000 homes are without power across the US East Coast Sunday after Tropical Storm Henri made landfall in Rhode Island. It's been downgraded from a hurricane, although many residents are still concerned about a possible storm surge. Hello and welcome to our look ahead to what the papers will be bringing us this Monday morning. Joining me tonight, the writer and broadcaster Mihir Bose and the former Pensions Minister, Conservative peer, Baroness Ros Altman. Welcome to both of you. Lovely to have you with us again. Let me bring you up to date at home with what the front pages are saying as we have them so far this evening. Afghanistan dominates most of them, you won't be surprised to learn. The FT leads on the news that the Prime Minister has convened a G7 meeting for Tuesday to discuss the ongoing situation. The Mail reports that Boris Johnson is expected to plead with President Joe Biden to extend the withdrawal deadline as fears grow that flights may be stopped within 48 hours. The Telegraph leads on that story, adding that UK forces are preparing for the possibility they'll have to evacuate Afghans through the country's land borders. The Eye's front page is on the worsening tensions between British and US politicians and diplomats after the former Prime Minister Tony Blair described the US decision to withdraw from the country as imbecilic. The Guardian reports that the Taliban have criticised the US for what it describes as anarchy at Kabul airport, suggesting its own fighters were the only ones capable of restoring order there. Meanwhile, the Metro focuses on the story of a British paratrooper who was photographed helping a baby and her mother over a wall at Kabul airport to safety. So let's kick off, if we may. Mihir, do you want to kick us off this evening with the FT? Johnson hosts crisis talks as role emerges for China and Russia, the paper says.
Yes, Johnson, Britain is the chair of the G7, and obviously we know the crisis that is taking place in Afghanistan, the rescue of people who work for the West, and we've seen horrific scenes. So Britain is trying to take steps, and clearly China and Russia, of course, who stand to benefit from what is happening in Afghanistan, are being pulled in if they can, if they will take any steps. The Security Council a resolution is being proposed. But I think what this shows, and this is the important point, is this situation has been created by the West. It has been created by Western intervention. You mentioned that Tony Blair spoke about imbecilic. But it was Tony Blair who 22 years ago, let's recall, made that great speech saying the West should intervene and change regimes and change government, bring goodness to the world. This was a new form of imperialism, not all that removed from what Alfred Milner said more than a century ago. But this is what the West is now paying for going into countries, not understanding what is there, and trying to change them. And what has happened in Afghanistan? We've had a corrupt regime where the army and everything else, the president leaves the country, flies away with a pot of gold, we're told, and things like that. And basically, we have created this mess. And instead of just wringing our hands, we should admit the mess we have created. And that goes back to several politicians, not just what Biden is doing at the moment.
The speech to which you're referring, I think, became known as the Chicago Doctrine, didn't it? Because it was delivered in Chicago, and anyone wants to search on that will probably find the text or indeed possibly even the video of Tony Blair speaking. Ros, it's interesting, this, isn't it? This is a role that Boris Johnson can adopt because he's got the authority of being chair of the G7, so he can bring the countries together. It's a good opportunity, this, potentially, for thinking beyond the evacuation phase as to what comes next and whether indeed we can in any way continue to influence the Taliban.
Well, I must say that I think Boris Johnson has got a a huge opportunity to try to bring the G7 together and help to stabilize the situation in Afghanistan. The situation is clearly chaotic. We've got people's lives being lost in trying to flee, and chaos at the airport. There's 5,000 or more US troops there, but they're not actually being able to control what's going on at the airport. And interestingly, the UK, I believe, is going to be trying to work with France to get a UN resolution, which they're hoping Russia and China will also join in. If Russia and China do join with other countries, that would be a really positive sign, because the risk is the West is losing out in a big way in what's happening in the Middle East and in some of the countries which are hugely unstable, and we have been helping to keep peace there. And if Russia and China take over and allow the terrorist activities to continue and the repression of the populations to continue, then there is really a serious threat, actually, to the West, not just within that country. At the moment, we've got to focus on the people within Afghanistan who need to escape or who need to leave, British citizens and others who've helped us, because their lives are at risk. But further down the line, we definitely have an issue here of how to protect our way of life in the West.
The Mail, Ros, has their headline under a graphic photo showing the scene at Kabul airport, making the point with captions that Taliban fighters and British troops are working pretty much hand in glove, or certainly working very closely together by necessity. This headline, don't cut and run yet, Joe, and certainly the pressure from the British seems to be, and there are sympathetic voices in Washington like the Defence Secretary Lloyd Austin, that saying we're going by the 31st is just not feasible.
Well, I certainly hope that the US and Joe Biden in particular will reconsider the current position. I think when they set the August 31st deadline, nobody expected this lightning speed takeover by the Taliban that has taken place. And clearly, many more lives are at risk. And unless the US does stay longer, there could well be huge bloodshed or huge risks for so many people. And one would hope that after all these years of being in the country, that the American administration would recognize the key role that it is playing now and needs to continue to play, while we try to get those people whose lives are so severely at risk, or foreign nationals who unexpectedly need to flee the country because nobody expected Kabul to be overrun like this, that the US should maintain its presence there at least for some more weeks while we get this job done.
Mihir, it's fascinating in some ways, isn't it, seeing this photo on the front of the Daily Mail, because you think not so very long ago, and admittedly British troops haven't been in a combat role for a couple of years ago, but not so very long ago, the guys on top of that wall there would have been doing their best to kill the guys at the bottom. And the whole thing was driven by a particular ideology and a philosophy that the British, as you were saying, partly inspired by that Chicago speech, were determined to rout.
Yeah, I mean, I think, of course, this is a very interesting picture, and I think it shows that the Taliban is trying to present this new image. You know, this is a different Taliban, yes, Islamic State and so on has said that, but this is not the Taliban that ruled Afghanistan and which the West removed after the 9/11 attacks. And this is, if you like, this is the Taliban trying to have a PR campaign to show it's a different one. I mean, I think the headline saying "Don't cut and run yet," Joe, I'm afraid I don't think Boris Johnson has much pressure to apply on Joe Biden. Biden has clearly decided, and he's following on from what Donald Trump agreed with the Taliban. Let's remember, he did a deal that the US was going to withdraw. Biden has just followed that deal, if you like. As far as one can make out, Biden's administration believes it's time for the US to leave. And frankly, the US should have known what would happen, because the regime it created was not a stable one. It was a corrupt regime. The regime did not have the allegiance of the people. In fact, I would say the Taliban has greater allegiance of the Afghan people than the regime that the Americans sustained for so long. So I suspect the headline might be very eye-catching, but I don't suspect that the US will actually delay its withdrawal. Biden has taken this decision. He wants to bring the troops home. He believes that is popular with the Americans, and I think that is what we're going to see, I'm afraid.
What about the front story, Mihir, of The Independent? Afghan asylum seekers in UK trapped in limbo.
Well, this is a very interesting story, because this is a story about Afghan refugees who've already come to this country. Now, we have said we're going to take about 5,000, but what this story has said is that the Home Office has refused to say if it has halted processing about 3,000 applications, and what it is going to do about them. And really, we need to look, given that the work that these Afghans did for us, given the help they gave our troops, we need to look at these figures. I mean, for instance, I found it very strange that Priti Patel should have suddenly dreamt up a figure of 5,000. Where did that come from? We, compared to other countries, are taking much fewer Afghan refugees, despite the clamour in some circles that we're taking a lot of refugees. And the fact that these refugees are in limbo does not say much for us and for our humane policies, of which we're so proud.
Ros, it's difficulty, this, isn't it, in terms of definitions? Because on the one hand, just a few weeks ago, the Home Office would have said, well, these Afghans, they've got no right to asylum. It's a perfectly safe country. They're here as economic migrants. We're going to send them home, particularly if they'd come in boats across the Channel after a long overland journey. Now, because of the nature of what's happening in that country, of course, we have to take a different position.
Well, I just think we are in such a different position now. We are duty-bound morally and as a matter of honour to ensure that the people who we led to believe in Afghanistan would have a brighter future, people who risked their lives to help us, we must take them in. We can't just turn our backs on them. And that's why I feel so sad that Joe Biden himself is not living up to what I would have thought was the duty of the West to demonstrate to people whose lives depended and still depend on the freedom that we suggested they could enjoy. We must not just run away. That cut and run, I'm sorry, I really think that we have our Western honour on the line and our way of life on the line. If we don't take in these refugees, these people who tried their best to help us and trust us against the background of violence that they were facing domestically, and we leave them to their fate to be killed or their families to be killed, who will ever trust us in the West again? What does that say about our standards? And what does it say about our long-term determination to protect and uphold what we believe are the right values? You know, we don't believe that Sharia law is a law that most people would be happy to live under. Maybe some would, but the young people in Afghanistan, we've been there for 20 years, they've never known the kind of repression that the Taliban regime, even if it is slightly less repressive than it was before, Sharia law is very different from, especially for women, from the kind of law that we are used to in the West.
I'm going to just pass over the front of the Metro. We'll just take a look at it for people who want to see it. It's a photograph of a corporal, unnamed paratrooper, who was photographed lifting a baby out of the crowd and the crush by Sky News last week. And he's quoted by the paper, he's not named for obvious reasons, saying, just picking up a word that Ros used there, I was just doing my duty. Let's move on to other stories. Ros, this is an interesting one. COVID emergency, this is on the front of the Telegraph, means flu jabs may not be effective this winter. I don't know about you, but I had my first flu jab last winter at the tender age of 52. And I must admit, part of the reason was thinking I don't want my immune system weakened before it faces the onslaught of COVID.
Yes, I must admit that I also had my first flu jab last year. So, my thinking was the same. What we do know, of course, is that every year we don't know for sure whether the current year's flu jab will actually be effective against the flu viruses that are circulating that particular year. But this year, the evidence that needed to be gathered, and that usually is gathered, to try and best inform the manufacturing of the vaccines, has been in short supply. I believe figures like 94% lower in terms of the evidence that's been gathered. People aren't flying around the world so much over the last 12 months, which has also meant that a lot of the data sharing and the information sharing and the evidence that would be gathered for different diseases in different countries and the way flu virus is spreading hasn't been available. So it is possible that this year's flu vaccine is even more of a potential hit and miss than the vaccines often are.
Yeah, the 94% figure here is about genetic sequencing, the amount of basically data, in other words, that's supplied. Because apparently, according to this, here, the World Health Organization makes the recommendation, made it back in February about what we will have to use for later this year, but doing so off the back of a big fall last autumn because of COVID lockdowns and all the rest of it, in the information that was available. It's making it a bit more of a lucky dip this year.
Yes, it is. And like the two of you, I also had a flu jab last winter. I not normally get a flu jab. And of course, the question that is raised here and what this story illustrates is how we determine what the flu jab should be. Because one of the things that's happened, of course, as a result of COVID is borders have been closed and there's been a 62% drop in shipments of influenza surveillance samples. And that determines what exactly is the proper jab for the flu that particular year, and that of if you like, is the collateral effect of the measures taken to combat COVID. So I think what the story suggests is that come winter we might have quite a big flu crisis on our hands because the jabs we may have will not work, or the flu variant that will be prevalent will not be effective with the jab. So even if we don't have a lockdown and COVID is dealt with, we probably need to be careful about the flu virus that is coming.
Keep those face masks to hand. Mihir, we've got a new political slogan to look forward to, according to The Guardian: jobs you can raise a family on.
Yes, this is the Labour Party, which is pledged to do a major overhaul of the universal credit system, which, of course, Labour has never been happy with. The universal credit system is claimed by about 6 million people, and the amount of money that they can claim, they had a £20 a week uplift, which is going to end in October. And the party, of course, trying to formulate policies which will be different to what the ruling party has, and presenting an image of having policies that could make it a government, though that looks very unlikely. Is going to come up with schemes which say that uplift should remain and the universal credit system should be considerably changed.
Ros, I know you'll be licking your lips at the figures on this one, but you're slightly frustrated, I imagine, because we don't have page 2. All we're told is that Jonathan Reynolds, the Shadow Work and Pension Secretary, is proposing a reduction in the universal credit taper rate, now set at 63%. So basically, it's kind of how much you lose for every extra pound you work. That's
right. Effectively, there is a 63% tax rate if you are on universal credit, which is higher than the highest tax rate faced, generally speaking, across the country. So clearly, if you reduce that taper rate, if you allow people to keep more of any extra pound that they earn, then that will be a better incentive for them to increase earnings than the current universal credit. But that adds to the cost of universal credit itself, because if you raise less in tax, if you like, then the cost is higher. But I think what Jonathan Reynolds wants to do is show that Labour is on the side of working people. This is a new deal for low-paid working people. If you're on low earnings and you're still working, you will get universal credit. And it also, I think they want to differentiate themselves from the Conservative government, which is saying we're going to take away the £20 uplift. And I would expect Labour will suggest that it wants to increase universal credit so that £20 stays.
Yeah. Might be interesting for those delivery drivers who were quoted in one newspaper today, Sunday, as earning less than the national minimum wage. Let's
Absolutely.
end, if we may, on the FT again. This is another story that might surprise people with big figures. Women on boards of UK blue chip companies paid 40% less than men. You know, we think of the problem of pay differentials as being big, but I suspect a lot of us assume that women at the very top are in a position where they're able to argue for a much better deal than women further down in employment. Doesn't look like that's the case for us.
Absolutely not. And actually, the figures are staggering. You know, the ONS shows that for ordinary working people, the gender gap is about 15%. That's bad enough. But when it comes to top paid women, non-exec women earn about average £104,000. Now, that's a pretty good salary, but men in the same positions get over 170,000. And if you're an executive in one of the FTSE 350 companies, as a woman, you'll earn about 1.5 million. Well, that's pretty nice. But as a man, it's about 2.5 million. And one wonders how one justifies that. Yes, we have made big progress, a lot more women on boards now. In 2015, it was only about a fifth of board positions were women. It is now over a third. So we've made improvements on the numbers of women in boards, but we haven't made improvements enough, certainly, in the parity between what men and women are paid at these senior levels. We're
out of time for now. Mihir, I'll give you a chance to respond to this story on our next paper review, if I may. It does raise, of course, the question about all those companies who are removing themselves from public listing, who will no longer have to give the data that would reveal this kind of information. That's it for the papers this hour. Mihir and Ros will be back at 11:30 for another look at the papers. Stand by for the weather. Coming up next, Susan Powell is at the map.
Hello. Sunny skies made decent inroads across the UK on Sunday. Some eastern counties were stuck with thicker cloud and some showers, but through the week ahead there should be some decent sunshine on the way for almost all areas at some stage. There will be nuances though day to day. Sunday, certainly, as I said, eastern counties did struggle with more cloud on the back end of an area of low pressure that was also producing some late showers, but as we move into Monday those will continue to fade out. There'll be a little bit of cloud out there. There could be a few patches of mist and fog because of the moisture on the ground as we go into the smaller